A 16-year-old black teen who can't speak walks into a courtroom, determined to defend his mother against a ruthless judge. He has no legal training, no lawyer, and no voice. Yet he dares to challenge a corrupt system that's already decided her fate. Can he prove her innocence before it's too late? If this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Justice belongs to those who fight for it, and this boy is about to take on the biggest fight of his life. Now, let's dive into his incredible journey. The sun was setting, casting a dim orange glow over the small apartment complex where Olivia Lewis and her son Jaden lived. The world outside carried on as usual, cars honking, neighbors chatting in the hallways, the faint hum of the city settling into the night. Inside their tiny home, the warmth of a home-cooked meal still lingered in the air, a simple comfort after another long, exhausting day. Then, bang, bang! The pounding on the door shattered the fragile peace like glass. The sound was sharp, urgent, filled with authority. Olivia, still in her cleaning uniform, froze mid-step. Her hands, calloused from years of hard work, trembled as she reached for the doorknob. Before she could even turn it, the door swung open violently. 2 officers stormed inside. Mark Whitaker led the way, his badge glinting under the dim hallway light. His face was carved with suspicion, his movements brisk and deliberate. He held a paper in one hand, the other resting on his holstered gun. Olivia Lewis? His voice was cold, clipped, already carrying a tone of judgment. Yes? Olivia's voice wavered as she instinctively took a step back. Whitaker didn't hesitate. He thrust the paper toward her. You are under arrest for theft and insurance fraud. His words were blunt, final, like the slamming of a gavel. Wait, what? Olivia's voice cracked as she took in the words on the warrant. Her breath hitched. This had to be a mistake. Before she could say another word, Whitaker grabbed her arm, yanking her forward. Her body jerked from the sudden force, her work bag slipping from her shoulder, spilling its contents onto the floor. A few crumpled dollar bills, a half-empty bottle of aspirin, an old receipt from the grocery store. The small remnants of a life lived paycheck to paycheck. Mom, a blur of movement. Jaden. He rushed forward, his hands frantically moving, forming signs, desperate to communicate. His lips parted, trying to force out words, but only choked, broken sounds escaped. His throat burned with effort. He knew the words, "She's innocent. Stop! This is wrong!" But his body betrayed him. Whitaker barely glanced at him. To him, Jaden was invisible. Take her, Whitaker ordered. The second officer tightened the cuffs around Olivia's wrists, the metal biting into her skin. Her eyes locked onto her son's, wide with panic, pleading. Jaden. Her voice was drowned out by the officers pulling her toward the door. Jaden reached out, fingers trembling, hands desperately forming words. Please, stop, don't take her, please. But no one was listening. No one ever listened. As the door slammed shut behind them, the apartment fell into an eerie silence. Jaden stood there, his hands frozen mid-sign, his body shaking. His mother was gone. And for the first time in his life, he realized, if he didn't fight for her, no one would. The fluorescent lights inside the police station buzzed faintly, casting a cold, artificial glow over the gray walls. The air smelled of stale coffee and old paperwork, thick with an unsettling sense of indifference. Behind a heavy metal door, Olivia Lewis sat handcuffed to a table, her wrists sore and red. Across from her, a detective flipped through a thin file, barely looking at her as he spoke. You know, if you just confess now, things will be easier for you, he said casually, like he was discussing the weather. I didn't do anything, Olivia whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of exhaustion and fear. The detective let out a slow, deliberate sigh. Mrs. Lewis, we have evidence, security footage, financial records. His voice was smooth, practiced, rehearsed for suspects who were too tired, too poor, too hopeless to fight back. Just admit it. Save yourself the trouble. Olivia gritted her teeth, shaking her head. I'm innocent. But her words held no weight here. Outside, in the crowded waiting area, Jaden paced restlessly, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. His chest felt tight, suffocating, as if the walls around him were caving in. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but no one would hear him. No one ever did. An officer walked past and firmly pushed him toward the exit. You can't be in here, kid. Go home. Jaden stumbled backward, hands flashing rapid, desperate signs. Where's my mom? She's innocent. Let me see her. The officer barely even looked at him. If you got something to say, say it. But Jaden couldn't. The lump in his throat grew heavier. He tried to force out a sound, but all that came was a strained, broken gasp. The officer sighed and turned away, as if Jaden were nothing more than an inconvenience, as if he didn't exist. His heart pounded. His hands shook. Tuit vong. Then, a hand on his shoulder. Jaden spun around to see Mia Rodriguez, her brown eyes filled with worry. She was breathless, like she had run all the way here. "Jaden, what's going on?" she signed. The moment their eyes met, the dam inside Jaden broke. His hands moved wildly, fingers forming words so fast they blurred together. "They took her. They're lying. They won't listen to me." Mia gritted her teeth. "Then we'll make them listen." She turned to the front desk, her voice steady but fierce. "Where is Olivia Lewis? She has a right to legal counsel." The officer barely glanced up. "She can get a public defender at the hearing." Mia's hands clenched into fists. She knew exactly what that meant. Public defenders were overworked, underpaid, and often barely glanced at their cases before walking into court. Olivia wouldn't stand a chance, and that's exactly what Judge Douglas Kane was counting on. Some judges believed in fairness. Others believed in efficiency. Douglas Kane believed in neither. He was the kind of judge who liked his courtroom silent and his rulings swift. He didn't waste time with sob stories. He saw defendants as numbers on a docket, not people with lives, families, or truths worth hearing. And Olivia Lewis, a poor black woman with no lawyer, she never stood a chance. At the pretrial hearing, he barely skimmed the case file before shaking his head. "She doesn't have an attorney?" Kane scoffed, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. He glanced at the prosecutor, already expecting a guilty plea. "Well," he mused, "that'll make this quick." Jaden watched in horror from the courtroom benches. His hands trembled on his lap, his nails digging into his palms. This wasn't justice. This wasn't even a trial. This was a conveyor belt to a guilty verdict. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. He could feel Mia's eyes on him, waiting for him to react, to do something. He had to do something. He turned to her, his fingers shaky but determined as they formed the words, "If no one else will fight for her, I will." Mia's eyes widened. "Jaden, that's crazy. You're 16, you're not a lawyer." But Jaden just stared ahead at the judge, at the prosecutor, at the system that was already preparing to crush his mother under its weight. "Then I'll learn." The kitchen table was barely visible beneath the mountain of papers, law books, and hastily scribbled notes. The overhead light flickered slightly, casting long shadows over the clutter. Jaden sat hunched over a thick book on criminal defense, his fingers tracing the words, trying to make sense of the dense legal jargon. Beside him, Mia scrolled through legal websites on her laptop, occasionally pausing to sign something in Jaden's direction. "I found something," she signed, turning the screen toward him. "A defendant has the right to an attorney. If they can't afford one, the court must provide." Jaden shook his head before she even finished. He had already read that. He grabbed a nearby notepad and wrote quickly, "That only applies if the defendant requests one at the time of arrest. They didn't give my mom a chance." Mia exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. The deeper they dug, the more loopholes they uncovered, but none in their favor. The law wasn't designed to be fair. It was designed to be followed. Jaden stared down at the book again, the words blurring together. Every sentence felt like a locked door. Every paragraph a wall between him and justice. He wasn't stupid. He was one of the smartest kids in his school. But this was a whole different battlefield. For the first time, he truly understood why lawyers spent years studying. It wasn't just about knowing the law. It was about knowing how to use it. And right now, it felt like he was learning how to fight blindfolded. Jaden rubbed his eyes, exhaustion settling deep in his bones. The clock on the wall read 2:47 a.m., but giving up wasn't an option. Mia sat across from him, flipping through another thick law book. She had been reading aloud and signing at the same time, but Jaden could see the frustration creeping into her movements. The legal language was too complex, too tangled in clauses and subclauses. She slammed the book shut. "This is insane. It's like they don't want normal people to understand it." Jaden picked up his pen and wrote, "They don't." Mia read the words and nodded grimly. The system wasn't broken. It was built this way. Built to make sure people like Olivia Lewis, People who worked too hard to fight back, people who didn't have money for a fancy lawyer, lost before they even stepped into the courtroom. Jaden clenched his fists. His mother was innocent. He knew it. But knowing the truth wasn't enough. He had to prove it. A sudden knock at the door made them both jump. Mia glanced at Jaden, her expression cautious. It was nearly 3 a.m. Who could possibly be here at this hour? Jaden moved quietly to the door and peered through the peephole. A police officer. His stomach dropped. Mia grabbed his arm. Do not open it. The knock came again, firmer this time. Jaden Lewis? The officer's voice was calm, but there was something cold beneath the surface. Jaden's hands moved quickly. What do they want? Mia didn't answer. Instead, she pulled out her phone and started recording. Mr. Lewis, the officer continued, still behind the door. I heard you've been looking into your mother's case. A word of advice? You're wasting your time. Jaden felt his hands shake, not with fear, but with fury. The officer paused, then added, it would be best if you just let things run their course. Jaden's breath caught. This wasn't a warning. It was a threat. Mia reached for his hand, her grip firm. They're scared, she signed. That means you're onto something. Jaden nodded, his heartbeat steadying. If they wanted him to stop, then he was doing something right. He turned back to the table, flipping open another law book. If no one else was going to fight for his mother, then he would, no matter what it took. The morning light barely filtered through the dusty blinds of Patrick Hensley's small law office. The place smelled of old books and coffee gone stale, shelves stacked with legal textbooks that hadn't been opened in years. Hensley sat behind his desk, flipping through a newspaper, with little interest. He was a man who had seen too much, fought too hard, and lost too often. The system had beaten him, and he had long since stopped trying to fight back. So when Mia and Jaden walked in, he barely looked up. I already know why you're here, he muttered, setting the newspaper down with a sigh. And the answer is no. Mia opened her mouth to argue, but Jaden had already grabbed a notepad and scribbled down his response. You haven't even heard us out. Hensley read the words, then let out a humorless chuckle. Kid, I don't need to. I know this case. Your mom is up against Judge Kane and the state's attorneys. You don't have a lawyer, and you sure as hell don't have a chance. Jaden's jaw tightened. He wasn't expecting encouragement, but the blunt dismissal still stung. Mia stepped forward, arms crossed. So that's it? You're just gonna let them destroy another innocent person's life? Hensley's eyes darkened. I've been where you are. I've tried. I lost. He leaned forward, voice heavy with something between exhaustion and regret. The system doesn't care about what's right. Jaden's hands moved quickly, frustration boiling over. Then why are you still here? Why keep a law office if you don't believe in the law? Hensley stared at the words for a long moment, his lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, he let out a sigh and stood. You kids should go. And just like that, the conversation was over. Hensley thought that would be the last he'd see of them. But later that evening, as he was locking up his office, he caught a glimpse of Jaden through the glass window of a nearby laundromat. The place was empty except for the boy, who stood in front of a cracked mirror, his hands moving in precise, determined motions. Hensley hesitated, watching from the sidewalk. Jaden wasn't just signing. He was practicing. In one hand, he held a worn-out legal pad, filled with arguments, counter-arguments, notes scribbled in the margins. He signed each phrase slowly, deliberately, as if speaking to an invisible courtroom. Then he would pause, adjust his stance, and try again. Even from a distance, Hensley could see the focus in his eyes. The boy wasn't just learning the law. He was preparing to fight. Something in Hensley's chest tightened. He had seen young lawyers crumble under the weight of the courtroom, seen seasoned professionals walk away in defeat. Yet here was a 16-year-old boy who couldn't even speak, rehearsing his arguments like his life depended on it. Because it did. For the first time in years, Hensley felt something shift inside him. The next morning, Jaden was back at Hensley's office, knocking on the door before it even opened. This time, Hensley didn't tell him to leave. Instead, he poured himself a cup of coffee, leaned against his desk, and sighed. All right, kid, let's hear it. Jaden's eyes flickered with surprise. He looked at Mia, who was practically beaming beside him. He didn't waste time. He pulled out his notes, signing his arguments with precision. pausing just long enough for Mia to translate. He laid out his mother's case, the inconsistencies in the evidence, the procedural flaws in her arrest. Hensley listened. Really listened. By the time Jaden finished, the room was silent. The old lawyer let out a slow breath and rubbed his temples. Then he leaned forward, eyes locking onto Jaden's. "Kid," he said, "you may not be able to speak, but you have something most lawyers don't." Jaden frowned, waiting. Hensley's voice softened. "You have the truth, and if you can make them see it, that's all you'll need." A small flicker of something, hope maybe, crossed Jaden's face. Hensley stood, stretching his aching back. "All right," he said, grabbing a book off the shelf and tossing it onto the desk. "If we're doing this, we're doing it right. You've got 2 days to learn everything in here." Jaden picked up the book, flipping through its pages, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. He looked up at Hensley, determination burning in his eyes. And for the first time in a long time, Hensley felt like he was fighting for something that mattered again. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom creaked open and all heads turned. The murmur of conversation faded as Jaden stepped inside, his heart pounding against his ribs like a war drum. He was used to being ignored, overlooked, treated like he didn't belong. But this was different. Every pair of eyes in the room landed on him, some filled with curiosity, others with amusement. A few, like those belonging to the bailiff, the court clerk, and the opposing attorney, held outright skepticism. He walked carefully, his sneakers squeaking softly against the polished floor. The oversized blazer he wore, borrowed from Patrick Hensley, hung awkwardly on his thin frame, the sleeves just a little too long. His tie was slightly crooked, but his posture was straight. His grip on his binder was tight. He refused to show fear. But the weight of the moment pressed down on him. At the judge's bench, Judge Douglas Kane looked up from his papers, brow furrowing as he took in the sight before him. A long pause stretched over the courtroom, thick with silent judgment, before Kane finally spoke. "Wait a minute," he muttered, leaning forward. "You're telling me this kid is the legal representative for the defendant?" He let out a dry, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "This has to be a joke," he said, his tone laced with open mockery. "Where's the real attorney?" A wave of low chuckles rippled through the audience, scattered voices whispering behind cupped hands. Jaden felt it, the pressure, the doubt, the weight of their expectations. Or rather, their lack of expectations. To them, he wasn't a real contender. He wasn't a lawyer. He was just a kid in a suit too big for him, standing in a place he had no right to be. But he stood taller. Seated at the prosecution's table, Assistant District Attorney Franklin Moore, a man in his 40s, with sharp features and a sharper suit, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk playing at his lips. "Well," Moore said loud enough for the room to hear, "this should be interesting." His voice carried the same patronizing amusement as Kane's, but with an added layer of condescension, the kind that only came from years of crushing underprepared defendants in court. He turned to glance at the spectators, shaking his head as if this whole thing was beneath him. "Tell me, son," he said, addressing Jaden directly now, his voice smooth, almost mocking, "did you find your legal expertise on YouTube? Or maybe a Law for Dummies book?" Laughter erupted from the gallery. Even some of the jury members smirked. Jaden didn't flinch. He had expected this. He had spent years being dismissed, underestimated, ignored, by teachers, by strangers, even by people who meant well. He had heard it all. He's smart, but he tries, but he's good at school, but that won't help him in real life. And now they saw him the same way. A kid, standing where he didn't belong. Jaden let the laughter die down. He didn't react. He didn't move. Instead, he slowly, deliberately placed his binder on the defendant's table, flipping it open to the first page. Then he raised his hands, and he began to sign. Mia, sitting beside him as his interpreter, immediately translated aloud. Her voice was clear, unwavering. "Your Honor," she read as Jaden signed, "the state may find this amusing, but I do not. I am here to present a case, and I expect to be treated with the same respect as any other legal representative." The room fell into silence. Even Judge Kane seemed momentarily thrown off. Moore's smirk faltered for just a second before he let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "All right, kid," he said, flipping open his own folder. "Let's see what you've got." Jaden tightened his grip on the edge of the table, steadying himself. This was it. They were laughing at him now. But by the time this trial was over, they wouldn't be laughing anymore. The courtroom had settled, but the tension hung thick in the air. Jaden sat at the defense table, back straight, hands resting on his open binder. Across from him, Franklin Moore leaned forward, adjusting his tie with a slow, deliberate movement, like a predator sizing up his prey. There was a glint in Moore's eyes, not of concern, but of amusement. He wasn't taking Jaden seriously. Not yet. "All right, Mr. Carter," Moore said smoothly, flipping through his notes. "You're here to defend your mother, correct?" Jaden nodded. Moore smirked. "And I assume you're familiar with Section 45 of the State Penal Code regarding financial fraud?" Jaden blinked. His mind raced, flipping through the pages of legal texts he had stayed up all night studying. Moore didn't wait for an answer. "Because," he continued, barreling forward, "if you had read it, you'd know that the prosecution doesn't even need to prove intent to establish liability. The evidence speaks for itself, doesn't it?" Jaden's fingers twitched. His heart pounded. It was a trap. Moore had intentionally thrown a legal technicality at him, hoping to trip him up, to make him look unprepared, out of his depth. A soft tap on his wrist. "Mia." Her eyes locked onto his, steady, reassuring. "Breathe." Jaden exhaled, then raised his hands. Mia spoke the words clearly as he signed. "If the evidence is real, then yes. But what if it isn't?" The murmurs started immediately. Moore's smirk wavered, just for a second, before he covered it with a scoff. "Are you suggesting that the prosecution's evidence is fabricated?" he asked, voice thick with mock disbelief. "You have proof of that, do you?" Jaden didn't answer. Not with words. Instead, he reached into his binder and pulled out a USB drive. He placed it on the defense table deliberately, letting the weight of the moment settle over the courtroom. Mia picked it up, her voice steady as she turned toward Judge Kane. "Your Honor," she said, "the defense would like to present a video as evidence." Judge Kane leaned back slightly, regarding Jaden with narrowed eyes. "You're wasting my time if this is speculation, Mr. Carter." Jaden met his gaze head-on. Mia spoke for him. "This isn't speculation. It's proof." The bailiff took the USB and inserted it into the courtroom's evidence system. The screen at the front of the room flickered to life. A security camera recording appeared, time-stamped from the night of the alleged crime. At first, it showed exactly what the prosecution claimed: Olivia Lewis at the store's register, interacting with the cashier. A financial transaction took place. Then, Jaden raised his hand. Mia translated. "Now, watch the timestamp." The room leaned in. The footage glitched, a subtle flicker, almost imperceptible, but then, a 3-minute jump. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Someone whispered, "No way." Judge Kane sat up straighter, expression suddenly unreadable. Moore's face drained of its confidence. Jaden lifted his hands, his movements now calm, controlled, confident. Mia spoke. "This video was altered. The original footage doesn't show my mother committing any crime. Someone tampered with the evidence to frame her." A long, heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Jaden's heart was still pounding, but now it wasn't out of fear. It was out of victory. He had just changed everything. A thick silence settled over the courtroom, so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. For the first time since the trial began, Assistant District Attorney Franklin Moore had no clever remark, no smirk, no snide comment. His fingers gripped the edge of his table, flipping through his case file as if looking for a lifeline. But there wasn't one, because the evidence had just been exposed as a lie. And sitting just a few feet away, Detective Mark Whitaker looked like he had swallowed glass. Jaden turned his gaze toward him, expression calm, but his eyes sharp, unrelenting. Whitaker shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His jaw was tight, his fingers twitching against his knee. He hadn't expected this. A 16-year-old kid, barely old enough to drive, had just dismantled his case in front of an entire courtroom. Jaden raised his hands, movements slow and deliberate. His confidence wasn't loud, but it was unshakable. Mia translated, her voice ringing clear. "Detective Whitaker, can you explain why the security footage conveniently jumps right at the moment the alleged crime took place?" Whitaker didn't move. "Detective?" Mia pressed, her tone unwavering. Still nothing. Jaden didn't break eye contact. He knew exactly what was happening. Whitaker was scrambling, thinking, calculating, trying to find a way out. But Jaden wasn't finished. Jaden turned back to his binder, pulling out another document. Mia read aloud as he signed. "This is my mother's official bank statement from the night of the alleged crime. It confirms that her account was charged for the purchase." He flipped to another page. "And this," Mia continued, "is a copy of the store's internal sales record, which matches my mother's transaction exactly." Jaden lifted his chin slightly, his neck signs sharp, precise, undeniable. There was no fraudulent purchase. He turned one last page. "And this," Mia read, "is the time-stamped security log from the store's system." The audience leaned in, their breath held. Mia continued. "This log proves that the store's security footage was accessed and altered remotely by none other than Detective Mark Whitaker." Gasps rippled across the room. Whitaker's face turned pale. Judge Kane sat back slowly in his chair, his hand resting on his gavel, but he didn't bang it. Not yet. His jaw was clenched, his piercing gaze locked onto Whitaker, waiting. "Detective Whitaker," Kane said, his voice dangerously low. "Would you care to explain this?" Whitaker swallowed hard, his hands clenched into fists. His career, his credibility, everything was crumbling before him. For the first time since this trial began, it wasn't Jaden who was out of place. It was the man who had framed his mother. The silence that followed was deafening. The jury sat frozen. The spectators whispered among themselves, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. And for the first time in his career, Judge Kane looked uncertain. This wasn't just a case of a struggling woman accused of fraud anymore. This was corruption, tampering with evidence, an officer of the law manipulating the system for his own agenda. Kane's fingers drummed against the wood of his bench. His cold, piercing eyes flickered between Jaden and Whitaker. Jaden held his breath, watching, waiting. And then, for the first time since stepping into this courtroom, he saw it. The shift, the recognition in Kane's eyes that he could no longer deny the truth. That Jaden Carter, a 16-year-old kid who couldn't even speak, had just unraveled an entire case and exposed a lie bigger than anyone had expected. And now, the system had no choice but to listen. The courtroom felt different now. The air that once carried the weight of dismissal, condescension, and doubt had shifted into something unspoken but undeniable. Respect. Judge Douglas Kane sat still, his fingers lightly tapping against the armrest of his high bench. The once arrogant smirk that had curled his lips at the beginning of the trial was long gone. In its place, a stern but contemplative expression. A man forced to reconcile with a truth he had been reluctant to acknowledge. Jaden stood firm, his binder still open but no longer needed, because he had done it. The evidence was irrefutable. The prosecution's case had unraveled before everyone's eyes. And the man who had once smirked at his presence in this courtroom, the same man who had openly mocked the very idea of a boy defending his mother, now had no choice but to listen. Judge Kane let out a slow, measured breath before leaning forward. His sharp gaze met Jaden's. There was no mockery left, no amusement, only a quiet recognition. "Mr. Carter," Kane said, his voice low but clear, steady but changed, "I have seen seasoned attorneys stand before this court and crumble under the weight of their cases. I have seen lawyers with decades of experience fail to construct an argument half as compelling as what you have presented today." Jaden didn't move. He didn't blink. He let the words settle, let them sink in, let them mean something. Kane's fingers tightened around the gavel. He glanced toward the prosecution's table, where Franklin Moore sat stiffly, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes downcast. Next to him, Detective Whitaker sat stone-faced, his career hanging in the balance, his own fate now uncertain. The judge exhaled through his nose. "This court finds Olivia Lewis," he lifted the gavel, "not guilty." The sound of the gavel striking wood echoed through the room. For a single, suspended moment, no one breathed. Then, the gallery erupted, gasps, murmurs, a few scattered cheers, and then an undeniable wave of applause. A reaction that rarely ever followed a court ruling, but today it couldn't be helped, because what had just happened wasn't just a legal victory, it was a triumph against a system that was never meant to be beaten. Mia let out a shaky breath beside Jaden, her hands clenching into fists before she turned toward him, her voice trembling but filled with something close to laughter. "You did it," she whispered. "Jaden, you actually did it." And finally, Jaden allowed himself to believe it. He turned, scanning the room, taking it all in. His mother, Olivia, eyes glistening with tears, hands covering her mouth in disbelief. The jury members, still seated, exchanging looks of quiet astonishment. The same people who had once laughed at him now sat in solemn respect. Then, his eyes met Judge Kane's one last time. The judge studied him for a beat longer before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod. A silent acknowledgement, not of pity, not of surprise, but of earned respect. The noise of the courtroom faded into the background, a distant hum against the pounding of Jaden's heart. He barely registered the scattered applause, the murmurs of shock, or the stunned faces around him. All he saw was his mother. She was still seated at the defense table, frozen, as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. Then, in an instant, the realization washed over her, and she burst into tears. "Jaden!" She rose so quickly that her chair screeched against the floor, but she didn't care. She ran to him, arms outstretched, her sobs breaking through the last of the courtroom's silence. And then, she was holding him. Her arms wrapped tightly around him, as if she could shield him from everything he had just endured. Her hands trembled against his back, but her voice, though broken with emotion, was full of nothing but pride. "You did it, Jaden," she choked out. "You saved me. You saved us." Jaden felt the weight of the past weeks, the sleepless nights, the self-doubt, the fear, all of it, melt away in her embrace. He had fought for her, and he had won. A deep chuckle broke through the moment. Patrick Hensley, the man who had once refused to believe in Jaden's chances, stood just a few feet away. His arms were crossed, but his face, lined with years of disappointment and lost battles, held something new. Pride. He let out a long breath, shaking his head, his voice thick with something even he couldn't quite mask. "This kid," he muttered, but then he lifted his gaze to meet Jaden's. "You didn't need a voice," he said, "because justice spoke for you." His eyes shone with something rare, admiration. "The courtroom heard you, kid," he continued. "Hell, we all did." He let out a small, almost disbelieving laugh. "You proved that the truth doesn't need volume. It just needs someone brave enough to fight for it." Mia nudged Jaden's arm, a grin breaking through her teary expression. "Told you," she whispered. Jaden let out a small breath. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, just relief. A sudden movement caught his attention. Judge Kane had stood from his seat. His imposing figure loomed over the bench, his once arrogant demeanor now stripped away, replaced with something heavier. He stepped forward, descending from his place of judgment, until he was standing eye level with Jaden. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, he spoke. "You did something today," Kane said slowly, "that many seasoned attorneys fail to do in their entire careers." Jaden felt the weight of those words. He hadn't just defended his mother. He had forced an entire system to reckon with its own corruption. Kane studied him a moment longer before his gaze softened, just slightly. "If there ever comes a day when you decide to become a lawyer for real," he said, his voice quieter now, "you come find me." Jaden's breath caught. "Because," Kane continued with the smallest nod of respect, "I'd be honored to help you get there." The words settled deep in Jaden's chest. For the first time, he saw not just an ending, but a beginning. Jaden turned, his eyes finding his mother's, his best friend's, and finally, Patrick Hensley's. He had done this for them. But now, he realized something. This wasn't just about one case. This was about so many others who never got the chance to speak, who never had someone to fight for them. And maybe, just maybe, this was what he was meant to do. As he stepped forward, out of the defendant's table, out of the courtroom that had once tried to silence him, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. Justice does not require a loud voice. It does not belong only to those with power, experience, or privilege. It belongs to those who refuse to be silenced. Jaden Carter was never meant to win. A 16-year-old black boy, unable to speak, standing alone against a system designed to break people like him. He wasn't supposed to fight back. He wasn't supposed to uncover the truth. And yet, he did. Because justice does not care about age, race, or disability. It cares about truth. Jaden didn't have a voice, but he made them listen. And now the question remains, if he could stand up and fight for what's right, what's stopping you? The world is full of injustice, full of moments where the powerful try to silence the weak, where the truth is buried beneath lies, where people are told they don't belong. But they do. And so do you, because justice isn't given. It's taken. It's fought for. It's demanded. And it only needs one person willing to stand up and say, I won't let this happen. So what will you fight for? If Jaden's story inspired you, don't let it stop here. Justice grows when we share it. Hit that like button to show your support, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that deserve to be told. Your support isn't just for us, it's for every voice that's been ignored, every truth that's been buried. Together we can make sure they're heard. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.